Welcome back. In my last episode, I had just finished hyping up a fun new piece of Magitech that will allow me to create custom dimensions. We will politely ignore the fact that the only reason I was really interested in said Magitech was because I wanted to adopt a cat, and will instead choose to focus on the no doubt incredible cost that such a project will incur. Or not. Because it turns out that not only is this whole thing possible to do with MV technology, it's actually quite cheap resource-wise. The most expensive and highest tier technology involved here is what I use to create my custom node, and that is more of a convenience than anything else, because my desired world is pretty much isomorphic to the kind of stuff that would generate just from smooshing together a bunch of Silverwood nodes. Technology certainly helps the process along, but it is far from a requirement. Vis commands are annoying, but only because I have to wait for my scepter to recharge, and the Essentia and item requirements are all stuff I already kind of just casually had lying around, so I can make do with just a little bit of microcrafting. I end up building the multi-block where the old Mega EBF was. The process of cracking open a node for dimensional stabilization runs the risk of a fair bit of collateral damage if I mess it up, and I would prefer to keep the inevitable explosions away from my delicate machines just in case I lose containment on the thing. I also swapped out Sano for Victus, because I had more Victus and it doesn't actually make a difference. Once the node is properly energized, all that I will need to do then is to crack it open and apply a signal from 4 transducers and let the attenuators, which are the blocks shooting blue laser woo-woos, compress the resulting singularity into its stable state. Before I crack open my new pocket dimension, I make sure to craft a few crystal wands with the resulting node. These are single-use items with 250 vis each, which should be more than enough to let me cheese a few higher-tier crafting recipes. This wasn't strictly necessary, as I'm getting to the point where I can make wands that just consider vis limits to be polite suggestions, but I can't justify keeping a cheap bit of spare cheese in my back pocket if for no other reason than it pairs well with the crackers crammed behind my eyeballs and the wine coming out of my mouth. Once those are made, I huck in the pearl, let the rift settle, and make a complete backup of my game because a game-breaking glitch with this exact process caused my previous Skyblock world to be corrupted, and then I hop in. So, these pocket dimensions are kind of interesting. My first thought when getting to the surface was, oh no, where are all my animals? This node had the right aspect ratio to spawn animals, and there is grass blocks for them to spawn on, so they should be here. I fly around a bit, make sure to grab a Vishroom for later, and then eventually run across exactly 2 ocelots on the far side of the sphere. This is a huge relief since I can duplicate ocelots with cookie arrows, but I can't make more of them out of nothing. My mission to get a cat has therefore then been a success. More flying around sees me picking up a bunch of non-stacking poppies. No idea what is up with those. Observing all sorts of impossible floating flowers and crops growing out of solid stone, and just appreciating in general how super janky this place is. A little bit more time sees me ending up playing detective with my axe at the stream, and that finally clues me in on what I think happened to the animals. The way the code for animal generation in these dimensions work is that you only get a certain number of animals before they will just straight up stop spawning. And rather than evenly distribute them throughout the pocket, it looks like it just kind of crammed them all into the same area and left the rest of the dimension animal free. Unfortunately, my animals spawned on the side of the sphere, and it looks like they got spawned underground, because I ended up picking a bunch of suspicious meat from the floor in that area. Ocelots don't take fall damage, and I have the meat from at least 2 of them in my inventory, so I suspect they probably just got spawned in and suffocated. If nothing else, this does present an opportunity to source some guilt-free cat meat for my nutrition grind. Of course, the instant I get back, I set to work replicating my ocelots and taming a cat. Take that, Gregtech New Horizons. I can tier skip emotional support animals, and you can't stop me. What can stop me, however, is the actual process of getting one of these things to eat my fish. Take the fish, kitty. Eat the fish. I wish to love and pamper you. Just stick the stupid fish in your face. It takes a depressingly long time for me to realize that in order to get ocelots to take your fish, they have to approach you, and I apparently kept spooking them because I was physically too close for them to exit their panicked state. Naturally, I take the time to make a comfortable sleeping space for my new kitty, and decide to name them Schrödinger. I make sure that Schrödinger is as close to being in the middle of my base as I can to ensure that they get underfoot as much as possible, because, you know, they're a cat, so honestly they probably didn't even need the help, but you know, it's the principle of the thing. For those who have been keeping track, yes, I am quite certain that I have spent the better part of a full day of my life doing nothing but grinding and building my technology base with the sole intention of getting a pet. I also, at this point, have plenty of uranium combs, not a whole lot of uranium, and absolutely zero radium. Fixing that problem is simple, but it will take a while for my machines to process everything, so I get all of that started and will revisit the process later once I move on to other projects. Other projects then include me figuring out what I'm going to do with all of my platinum metallic powder. I need platinum for my coil upgrades and will need even more for circuitry and machine parts, so getting a platinum processing system automated is essentially a requirement. But for now, I'm just gonna do it by hand. Quite a lot of things are waiting on my ability to transfer over to an applied energistic setup, and the plat line is no exception to this rule. The first step in the process is processing the dust with aqua regia to create creamy platinum juice stuff. The creamy platinum juice stuff then gets thrown in with some pure white stinky juice stuff in a centrifuge for a little bit to turn into a bunch of different kinds of fluid and magical powder. And now that I have two very time-intensive processes running, what else am I going to do? Well, I guess add some more multi-blocks to the collection, because it isn't like I'm ever going to not need more pointlessly big multi-blocks. I end up setting my sights on a sifting machine, not necessarily because I need one right now, but I will need one at some point, so I might as well get working on it. As with most other multi-blocks at this game stage, this one follows the same refrain of make some alloy, make some blocks, and build a thing as every other one does. And will, like every machine ever, take forever to get the parts for. My centrifuges, having finally finished the first round of platinum processing, then spit out a bunch of small dust and various kinds of fluids I mostly don't care about. The dusts need to be further processed, but this round of refinement granted me slightly over 32 pure platinum dust. Yay! Now I just have to repeat that every time I want to make platinum. I'm beginning to regret blasting through my research projects at this point. Yes, it is definitely nice to have them done and basically be able to hang up the Thaumcraft hat forever, but by that same token, I now kind of have nothing to do once all of my machines are queued up with processing tasks. Case in point, this EV autoclave I make for processing tungsten is like the single most interesting thing I did for a solid hour of game time. While waiting on my machines to process, I end up having a lot of free time to read through my quest book and some wiki pages. As I see it, I am very quickly going to start pushing up against the limits of my energy production, not because of a lack of fuel production, but because of a lack of higher tier engines to consume said fuel. Single block engines are a possibility, but I am well into the territory of diminishing returns, and I would like to start migrating to a more centralized power supply system. Multi-block combustion engines are an option that I seriously considered, but I'm just honestly not a huge fan of them, pun absolutely intended, and their long-term usability relies on me being able to scale diesel production, which is definitely possible, but also not terribly interesting. Instead, I naturally find myself gravitating towards the nuclear option. Literally. There are a couple of very solid, in my opinion, reasons motivating my choice here. The first is cost. Uranium fuel rods are trivial for me to source in bulk once I have phthalic acid production working at scale, and that is something I'm going to need anyway because I'm very quickly going to be relying on bees for most of my higher tier raw materials. Nuclear reactors are comparatively cheap to build, as cheap as multi-blocks in this tier get, at least. And since their only substantial high-tier material investment is 160-something titanium, this is a quite palatable startup cost, even in my economy. The second reason is the time investment required to get the systems up and running. Compared to other options which would require expansive and time-intensive designs, building, multi-block requirements, and automation to run for the weeks of in-game time that I'd be using them, nuclear reactors are kind of the caveman option, in so much as they are dumb, very simple, and very fast to build. Basically, fresh fuel rods go in, depleted fuel rods come out, and that's all I'm going to need to worry about. For all but the most complicated and over-the-top designs I have available to me right now, that's really all it is. The trade-off here is the relative lack of efficiency and scalability, because higher power nuclear reactors do exist, and they start to very quickly get more obnoxious to maintain as you scale their energy output. The quest book says that they start falling behind somewhere in IV, and I don't entirely agree with that assessment, but it's not entirely incorrect either. Before I can start those, though, something more important happened. I have plutonium. This is a very special, very spicy hot spice colored metal that I can use to convert uranium into radon, which is the last ingredient I need to make the last ingredient I need for a laser engraver to make presses, to make circuit components, to make circuits for ME systems. The only problem with this is that plutonium is kind of just a little teeny itty-witty bit turbo-radioactive, and I am very much not in a position to be safely handling it or basically touching it at all. Since I only need a small amount of radon, by which I mean, like, only as much as I can get my hands on, I just opt to apply the good old hopper into a Stone Age furnace technology, with an item conduit slapped on the end of it. Since each 100 millibuckets of uranium takes a mere 2.5 minutes to process, I'm going to need to wait a hot second before I can get this going, but it's good to have automated. Transferring plutonium without handling it takes me an embarrassingly long time. Like, a solid 5 minutes. The time-lapse has done so much good for me that I actually look vaguely competent doing this on the video, but I assure you that this is just movie magic at work. It took me a long time to realize that furnaces' input and output sides were side-specific, and this ended up confusing me for much longer than it should. Quantum eyes, which is the thing I'm making with radon, need a higher tier chemical bath to make, so I also apply myself to that situation. That machine, combined with radium and an ender eye, produces me a single solitary quantum eye, which is the last ingredient I need for my engraver. Now, all I need is to twiddle my thumbs a bit until the presses are done. The next thing I do here is probably going to confuse a few people. I take the time to go back and do a couple of Stone Age quests related to Tinker's tools. You see, for some weird reason, the Applied Energistics questline is an exception to the general format of how quests are structured, in that it does not have a single first quest that unlocks everything with an AND operation. Instead, it has multiple starting points, and one of them is gated behind an OR operation. If the unlock were to happen with an AND operation, I would need both quest prerequisites to proceed, in which case this would be impossible because I would have to complete an EV tier parent quest. However, since it unlocks with an OR, part of this quest line is actually accessible to me as long as I do some homework first, which means there is a potential for more interesting loot bag drops. Since the only thing these quests need is a squick of bronze and a quick nostalgia trip to the Crucible, they get hammered out in short order, and my theory is proven correct. I have successfully unlocked a new quest tree. This quest tree is a nightmare, by the way, and it is in no way the fault of whoever made it. Applied Energistics plus all of its add-on mods is truly just that fiddly, expensive, and annoying to get started. The payoffs are absolutely worth it, however, so I soldier on and add its project to the queue. As with everything in this mod pack, feel free to ignore the amount the quest says to make of any item, and instead start with a stack, unless you know that you're going to want more. Case in point, I know better, so I'm going to start by making a mere 6 stacks of gold circuits. Why no, I'm not compensating for anything. I just legitimately have that much storage that I need to worry about. Speaking of not compensating for anything, I got sick and tired of not having enough input and output buses and hatches, so I just made a stack of various HV types when I was doing my nuclear reactor component assembly. Since the hatches are pretty much modular for every machine that I'm going to be making in the distant future, I am certain that they're going to be used at some point. Applied Energistics will require a substantial amount of Certus and Nether quartz in order to make all of the fiddly little nonsense that it uses. And if it weren't for the incredible power of cheesy alchemy, this would be a terribly obnoxious problem, since quartz would be slightly tricky to source at scale. Thankfully, Thaumcraft has once again swooped in and saved the day, because rather than measure out any particular quantity, I just decided I'm going to dump a barrel of glass dust, charcoal, and water into a crucible and see what happens. What happens ends up being about 30 stacks of Certus quartz, which I strongly suspect will be enough for a little bit, and I repeat that process for Nether quartz as well. To give all my quartz a chance to process, I switched back to the assembly of my sifter multiblock. To be entirely honest, I do not expect this machine to be exceptionally useful at the moment, given my general lack of anything even remotely resembling siftable ore, but it was relatively cheap to make, which means I never again have to make or use a single block sifter for anything ever, and I needed something to do with my time. It is also, stupidly fast. LV single block sifters take 30 seconds to sift a single item, for the most part. This thing's tooltip says that by default it is 400% faster, and will sift 4 items for each voltage tier above LV, which means I'm also going to be getting a huge parallelization bonus for powering it at HV. And it uses less energy than the single blocks. The next basic applied energistics materials that I need are called pure crystals. I could autoclave them, but I'm cheap and have free time, so I decide to just make a small mountain of them and throw them in a pool of water to crystallize the normal way. And at this point I'm also done with my nuclear reactor parts, but encountered an odd stumbling block in the form of wire wrapping. Platinum wire, which is needed for the reactor, needs either more platinum to wrap it, or some nonsense called polyphenylene sulfide. I'm cheap, so I of course went with the polyphenylene sulfide coating instead of the 3 ingots of extra platinum to case the 1 cable that I need, but that necessitates a great deal of fluid manipulation nonsense, and my chemical reactors are already backlogged by making charge Certus. Lesson to learn from this experiment is that I really need some more LCRs. As with everything, I ignore basic math and just make a large quantity of all of the precursors and slam them together. I don't really care about overcrafting at this point because it is just not worth the time to do the math on. With that stumbling block out of the way, on to the fun stuff. Nuclear reactor design in Industrial Craft is a really cool gamified version of what goes on in an actual real-life nuclear reactor. I am going to be generous and assume that most of you here are not either nuclear engineers, computer scientists, or massive flaming nerds, so I will omit the fully technical explanation of how the simulation works, but the general idea is that your nuclear reactor is a very expensive metal chest, and putting more chambers on it makes it bigger. Putting fissile material in the chest makes heat and electricity. Putting fissile material next to more fissile material makes the chest output even more energy more efficiently, but also make more heat. And if that chest gets too hot, it melts into a pile of slag and explodes. This is where the realism ends, because that is absolutely not what it should do, because there is no coolant to flash heat, there's no chemically unstable materials that would overpressurize the casing. Anyway, I digress. To help with the more hotter, more kablooey problem, there are oodles of different things you can stick in this very expensive metal chest that make the heat go away. They all have super cool interactions, ha, and designing reactors would be a fun minigame if you politely ignore the fact that optimal designs for reactors have been found for pretty much every definition of optimal that players cared about. So you can just kind of look them up, which is what I did. If and or when they blow up, these fancy metal chests also have the unfortunate effect of sort of maybe obliterating everything in a 3-chunk area, so I will be surrounding mine in warded glass just in case it decides to act up, and will only access it with an elevator. There is no real reason why the design should explode, but you never know. I also don't actually need to be pulling power from the thing all the time, so I'm not even going to bother supplying fuel rods yet. This is just another machine that I'm going to need in the future, and since I'm waiting on circuit parts right now, I just wanted to get started early. After some time passes, it turns out that ME system plans are being bottlenecked by my relative lack of random lower tier circuitry. Since I usually only make 2 stacks at each tier, my reserves of the things have been steadily trickling down every time I go back and pick up new projects. So it's time to solve that problem once and for all. Yeah, right. It's time to solve that problem for now, at least. Because of the exceptional amount of nonsense involved in making components for them, my polyethylene reserves have run dry, forcing me to find a better supply than that one little dinky distillery system I had back in the days when I was, still using wood as a construction material. Hilariously, this solution ends up with me needing ridiculously large amounts of dirt, which is something I only ever really get in a trickle from dirt creeper kills. I debated automating an old corpse route for about 0.2 seconds just for the meme, and then remembered that I actually also have an entire custom dimension full of the stuff, so that problem solved itself very quickly. With more than a little bit of wheat farming, I can then combine the product of my farms with random dimension dirt to get compost, and then run compost through my pyrolyse oven for absurd amounts of biomass. My distillery tower, unlike the single block distilleries, is actually designed to process this stuff in a timely manner, and the end result is lots and lots of ethanol. My circuits end up taking so long to produce that I decide to start a new project, making a large batch of epoxy for more circuits, but with a different recipe. If variety is the spice of life, my current occupations are probably making cardboard look pretty darn appealing right now. Epoxy requires 4 chemicals, and I can source 3 of them easily. Epicyclohydrin, hydrochloric acid, and phenol are all trivial to make, but acetone is slightly more obnoxious due to my lack of oil refineries. I solve this problem the brute force way by throwing acetic acid, also known as vinegar, at it until it goes away. By this point, I have constructed HV tier LCRs just so that I can alleviate some of the chemical processing demands on my single block machines, so I can script those to the task as well. Another hour or 2 passes without note, and then finally, at long last, enough of my ME system components finish processing that I can begin item consolidation. I choose to set my terminal up right between the LV and MV machine banks, a location that makes much more sense once you consider that said machine banks are going to very quickly go the way of the dodo. And I can make sure to give the system a dedicated power supply and a tank of backup fuel here much more conveniently, because if this system goes down, all of my stuff goes with it, and that is bad news. While it might be hilarious to watch me flail around and try and restore power, it's not something I would like to avoid, considering if I do it wrong, I'm going to be going back to the Stone Age until I can generate electricity again. ME systems have a few quirks to their operation that I'm not going to touch on, but the general idea is that you want to avoid loops wherever possible, don't cross chunk borders in weird spots, which isn't a problem for me because my whole island is rendered anyway, and to make sure that you never ever carry more than like about 20 of the drives full of stuff at a time. To be safe, I generally limit myself to 20, but you can go higher. The problem here is that ME drives can store so much stuff that holding too many of them will sort of break Minecraft's memory, and that breakage causes unrepairable world corruption or chunk reversion and can do some really, really bad things. If you're familiar with the vanilla duping tech that uses a bunch of written books in shulker boxes, that is a very specific use case for this general bug. As to be expected, most of the public attention is using this glitch to dupe stuff, but there is cool applications for it that I'm forbidden from doing because the rules of the run say no. So, with all that being said, my concern is just to not accidentally delete a hole in my base, and don't carry too many of them at once and I'll be fine. And truthfully, my goal here is even less glorified than that. I just wanted a bigger box to shove things into. And boy howdy did I make a bigger box. I never really paid all that much attention to how much stuff I was collecting, but now that I'm forced to physically transport it over, the sheer scale of nonsense that I have been creating in this world is really starting to hit different. All of this stuff that you see came from dirt. Like, literally everything here is something I had a physical hand in crafting, either by making it myself, or growing it, or making a machine to automate it for me. I made every single item that I have access to right now. I've said it before, I'm probably going to say it again, and I will almost certainly continue to say it in the far future, but the fact that this mod pack is put together well enough to let me pull this rule set off is incredible. My inventory repositioning project is quickly put on hold, however, because something even more interesting happened during the recording for this episode that I want to share as soon as possible. By sheer chance, someone I knew in real life and had played this mod pack with before got recommended my channel, recognized me, and sent me a very special message. Since we happen to be similar in many respects, the message naturally focused on how to most effectively obliterate anything resembling balance or common sense, and I was blessed with this wonderful image and the following quote. So, it turns out the overchanter has a little trouble identifying what the natural maximum level of an enchantment is. There is a lot to unpack in this image, so I'm going to break it down. But first, I want you to recall what I said about locating cheese. Cheese is generally located best in... No, I'm not doing the bit again. Let's start with the fact that they got Unbreaking 11 using an overenchanter. Overenchanters only overenchant by one level, so that implies they got Unbreaking 10. Somehow. Which is actually not terribly tricky, because a lot of special mobs drop custom joke items with nonsense enchantments, and it just so happens that some of those joke enchantments are Unbreaking 10. Take one of those, stick it in an overenchanter, and you get Unbreaking 11. Eventually. This thing's kind of slow, but I can fix that. After that, stick the item in a disenchanter, and then you are the proud owner of an Unbreaking whatever enchanted book. Easy peasy. The real trick is what you're supposed to do with this book. Anvils are generally smart enough to realize that putting Unbreaking 10 or 11 or 200 or whatever on your super valuable and very useful golden pickaxe is kind of not what they're supposed to be doing, so if you try to do it anyway, you will just end up with a boring, lame Unbreaking 3 golden pickaxe. I checked all of the obvious anvil options, and it seems like they all respect this limitation, so there's no really easy way of doing this. Fortunately for me, I have other options. The Britannia Mana Enchanter is a somewhat misappropriately named multi-block that uses mana to copy enchantments from enchanted books thrown on the ground near it onto an item. Unlike literally every other anvil I can find, it is unique in that it does not give a single solitary peanut about what level those enchantments are. It only checks if the tool it's applying them to could accept them normally. So, no Sharpness 3 pickaxe for me. Unfortunately for my anonymous associate, They are stuck playing plain old boring vanilla Gregtech New Horizons, and as such have not quite developed the same refined cheese detection system that I have. My associate got their Unbreaking 11 boots by mana enchanting and Unbreaking 10 book onto them and then over-enchanting them to 11. But in doing so, they missed a very important question. How does the over-enchanter know when to stop over-enchanting? It clearly doesn't care about the level of enchantment. We know over-enchanters don't respect vanilla maximums when over-enchanting, and I know, though I haven't made a point of mentioning it thus far, that they do not over-enchant the same enchantment twice. For example, I could not over-enchant a Sharpness 2 sword to Sharpness 4, even though Sharpness 2, 3, and 4 are all allowed enchantments in vanilla Minecraft. With all of this taken together, these restrictions seem kind of odd, and are enough to make me suspect that something else was going on. Spoilers, I was right. Let's say, for example, I have a Fortune 3 book and a wooden pickaxe. I want a Fortune 4 wooden pickaxe, so I slap Fortune 3 on it, over-enchant it, lose my hearing as the World Accelerator does its job, and then bing bang boom, Fortune 4 wooden pickaxe. Cool. The Draconic Evolution Disenchanter clearly can correctly disenchant over-leveled enchantments because it was working with Unbreaking 10. So, let's strip off Looting 4 and apply it to a stone pickaxe using the Mana Enchanter. Now I have a Fortune 4 stone pickaxe. Cool. What happens if I over-enchant it again? According to everything we know about the over-enchanter, it shouldn't work. The over-enchanter can only over-enchant one level above the maximum vanilla enchantment level, except that that's not the case, because we have already proven that over-enchanters don't care about the maximum level of an enchantment at all. So, of course, now I have a Fortune 5 stone pickaxe. What on earth is going on here? The data about which enchantments can be over-enchanted is not in any way related to the enchantment itself, and is instead tied to the tool that happens to hold that enchantment. The real restriction on the over-enchanter is that it can only over-enchant a specific enchantment once on any given tool, and that data is not transferred when you mana enchant from an enchanted book. This means that there is, of course, only one acceptable path of action. It's time to play a game. The name of the game is Does It Stack? The rules of the game, well, you're probably familiar with them at this point. Hold, please. While that goes on, let's talk about mana enchanting. This mana enchantment process is not infinite, sadly. Mana enchanting gets exponentially more expensive as the level of enchantment increases, so there will come a point where it becomes intractable to supply the mana cost involved. Fortunately for us, though, that exponential growth is really quite slow. For those interested, the equation to calculate its cost is this. Since Fortune has a weight of 2, and is the only enchantment that I am applying, enchanting my Thaumium tool with, like, say, Fortune 21 would take about 7.2 million mana. Each normal mana pool holds 1 million, making this really quite a cheap process by the standards of even vanilla Britannia. Of course, since this is exponential growth, it means that doubling that level to Fortune 42 would then require 4 times the mana at about 28 pools, which is entirely doable but mildly inconvenient, and a whopping Fortune 100 pickaxe would demand a hilarious 162 pools of the stuff, which is still possible by technicality, but the infrastructure required would probably make your server owner mildly unhappy with you. This is well into the realm of goose tech, folks. Just because you can do it does not mean that you should do it. All of this to say, yes. The answer is yes. I ended up calling it quits at Fortune 21 because I value my life, but there does not seem to be an upper limit to how hard you can push this mechanic. Best of all, it is entirely within the realms of the challenge to use this tech. Every single part of this system is functioning exactly like it was designed. It is not my fault the mod authors did not consider the possibility of an over-caffeinated foie gras, deciding it would be a good idea to ask pointed questions about game mechanics. Designing systems strong enough to make this scale viably in the real world, however, is going to be a project for another time. As always, thank you for yours. If you feel like over-enchanting my channel, there are several convenient buttons to press located below with no limits, mana, or hearing loss required. And I hope you enjoyed.